So, it's time to review the Bombers, and after spending nearly 40% of last year in the top 4 before falling out of the 8, can this be the year that they take it the next step further, or will it be another year of heartache? My name's Woody, and this is Wooden Spoon Data, the 18th best AFL content on YouTube, and in today's video, we'll be taking a look back at Essendon's best 22 in 2024 to see where they excelled and where they still need to improve. We can also add the players acquired over the offseason to determine what sort of changes the Bombers might see in 2025 and if that'll be enough to get them back to being a contending top 4 side. To do this, I've made a simple spreadsheet to compare Essendon's players against the average player in the same position, and we can also compare each player against an average top 4 player in the same position over the last 5 years. I have taken some liberties to include best 22 players in the 2024 lineup who missed large chunks of the season through injury, but I've tried to have minor influence. So basically, I've taken every stat and every position and then compared stats between an average player in a given position and a top 4 player in the same position from the last 5 years to determine what stats are important for each position.
Positions!
For example, Sam Durham had 36 out of 42 important stats above the average midfielder this past year, but that drops to 27 out of 42 if we were to raise that average to a top 4 mid over the last 5 years. The average midfielder had 5.12 ground ball gets per match last year, Durham had 5.97 and therefore was more than the average 2024 midfielder. But if we compare him to a top 4 mid over the last 5 years, where the average has been 6.4, he is lower than an average top 4 mid. Make sense? Good. So we did that for every position and every stat we deemed important for each position. Finally, once we determined the best 22 the Bombers could field from this past year and this coming, we can compare the players selected as a whole against the average production from a top 4 side over the last few years. So let's start with defence. Essendon's key defenders this past year were Ben Mackay and Jayden Laverde, who both played 21 games or more. With Jordan Ridley injured for the majority of the year, he did only manage 9 matches. Finally, Zach Reid and the now departed Sam Wiedemann only played the 1 match. With a total of 55 matches played across all their key defenders this past year, we can divide that number by 23 games and determine the Bombers average and prefer 2.39 key position defenders played per match. Essendon did not add a key defender with AFL experience to their list this offseason, nor did they draft one. Looking at matches played, there were 2 clear leaders in Mackay and Ridley, so we'll have them in both years' lineups. But do we look at a third tall role? When I look for the best structure for a team, I mostly consider the preferred average for that role. If that isn't obvious, I look at the group for that part of the field and their overall output, and then perhaps more importantly, how that decision affects the rest of the team's output and needs. In this case, I will only go for 2 key defenders as I couldn't find a way to increase the defensive group or the overall team's above average numbers when adding Laverde. I do think there's a reasonable chance that the Bombers look at 3 players in this role, but I think they're hoping to see Zach Reid's body come good. As a side note for Essendon supporters who haven't seen our previous team reviews, my initial system didn't take into account players that had lower average time on ground due to subs, injury or whatever. In my new formula, I essentially normalize time on ground by dividing all the stats down to the minute, then I can scale that up to the average time on ground. While 30% of game time in 1 match isn't a huge sample size, with the time that Zach Reid had on field, his performance had a score of 11 out of 37. So I essentially think he can be much better than the numbers here show and could get that 3rd key defensive role that I couldn't fit stats-wise. Considering we won't be adding anyone, let's have a look at some of the most important stats for key defenders. As is customary, let's start with the positives. Both Mackay and Ridley are ahead of target for disposals per turnover, intercept possessions and marks. Where I'm a bit more worried is tackles, loss percentage, 1%ers and spoils. So basically it appears that both of these players are good at usage and assisting in an intercept role, but perhaps more exploitable in one-on-one contests. But let's have a look at the medium defenders before seeing if that applies to the defensive unit as a whole. This past year, Nick Martin, Andrew McGrath, Mason Redman, and the retired Dyson Heppell and Jake Kelly all played 18 games or more. With a total of 105 matches played across all their medium defenders this past year, we can divide by 23 and determine the Bombers average and prefer 4.57 medium defenders per match. Essendon added former Lion medium defender Jaxon Prior via the SPP this offseason, but the numbers don't particularly help the Bombers, so we won't be discussing him further. They also added Angus Clark, Zach Johnson, and Jaden Yuen via the national and rookie drafts this offseason. And while I do think there's a reasonable chance that some of these players get games, I don't think their numbers are better than existing options. With the preferred medium defensive numbers in mind, I will only be going with 4 medium defenders in the 2024 lineup, and that means Jake Kelly misses out. Keen-eye viewers might have noticed that Nick Martin's top 4 numbers actually went up against his 2024 above average numbers. I said it in other team reviews, so go back and watch them to see more stats like this, but there are certain stats where a top 4 player from the last few years has technically worse numbers than an average player in the same role from this past year. In this instance, Martin averaged 5.603 disposals per turnover. A top 4 medium defender over the last few years averaged 5.60, so he just got a point. Whereas the average 2024 medium defender had 5.98 disposals per turnover, so he didn't get a point. This is generally due to better players taking the game on more, resulting in lower disposal per turnover numbers than more defensively orientated players. Martin also averaged 0.565 frees against. The average medium defender in 2024 had 0.56, so because he had more frees against, he didn't get a point. Whereas a top 4 medium defender had 0.66 frees against, giving Martin that point. Again, this mostly comes down to better players being at the contest more often, meaning they have a higher chance to give away a free. But let's get back to discussing some changes that might happen for the 2025 lineup. First off, Heppell's departed, so he needs replacing, and I haven't mentioned him earlier as the AFL and champion data have him listed as a mid, but the numbers suggest that Archie Roberts would be the next best in that role. Secondly, I have heard the discussion of Merritt to the halfback flank and Martin to the mids again, and while I think there would be some benefits as Martin's mid numbers are good and Merritt as a medium defender wasn't bad with 20 out of 37 and 21 out of 37 against a top 4 average, but he was reducing the sum of the defensive group by -2. This is because Merritt had lower numbers in intercept marks, rebound 50s, and kicking efficiency. He was a positive in hardball gets though, and look, when I think about him playing in that role, I do think that those deficiencies probably improve. But Martin hardly seems like a massive improvement on Merritt in the mid group, so I will keep things as is to keep the best numbers for the Bombers' defensive and mid total output between years. So let's have a look at the medium defenders versus top 4 medium defensive comparison charts before looking at the overall defensive output changes. Starting with the positives. In 2024, everyone was above target for disposals, intercept possessions, handball receives, and everyone remaining is ahead of target for rebound 50s. If we just look at Heppell and Roberts for a second, we can see that Roberts is ahead for everything except rebound 50s, intercept marks, and 1%ers. Also, if we look at the 2025 medium defenders now, we can see that everyone is behind target for 1%ers too. So let's move to the overall output between years to see if this is an area of concern or not. And yes, 1%ers sit fairly below an average top 4 team. Likewise for spoils, and contested marks are also behind target and don't show strong indications of improvement. But let's focus on the positives for a second. Intercept possessions, ground ball gets, handball receives, total marks, and disposals are through the roof. And while disposals per turnover are quite good, they could well reduce this coming year, and all that good work doesn't seem to translate to equally high rebound 50s, score involvements, or score launches. From what we see here, with spoils being so low, it suggests that contested and intercept marks should be an area of focus. But getting possession isn't a huge problem. Essendon get enough of the ball defensively, but not enough of it is meaningful possessions. As in 2024, they were just below the AFL average for scoring from the defensive half with 32.4%. In 2024, the sum of the Bombers' defensive output had 29 out of 37 important defensive stats above that of a top 4 defence. With this defensive lineup in 2025, the sum of Essendon's defensive output would see them reduce slightly to 27 out of 37 important stats above that of a top 4 defence. But let's see if the mids are creating space and doing enough with their opportunities. This past year, Zach Merritt, Jai Caldwell, Sam Durham, Nick Cox, Archie Perkins, Xavier Dersma, and Darcy Parish all played over 12 games, with Dylan Shield playing 9, Elijah Sardis playing 7, and Will Satterfield and the aforementioned Archie Roberts playing just the 4 matches. The Bombers didn't add a midfielder with AFL's experience or via the draft, so we're going to have the same midfield in both years. So let's figure out who's best suited. With a total of 157 matches played across all their midfielders this past year, again dividing by 23, we can determine Essendon average and prefer 6.83 midfielders per match. When looking at basic numbers, there were 4 clear leaders in Captain Zach Merritt, Sam Durham, Jai Caldwell, and Will Setterfield. Due to matches played, I'm gonna put Setterfield on the bench, but who else makes it in the mids? The next 2 best players for the sum of the starting mids were Darcy Parish and Xavier Dersma. So the final starting mids are set, but are we going to be sticking with 6 or is there more? Well, I'm actually going to go with 8 mids, and to explain why, we need to have a little chat about the bench. So the bench in this model essentially functions as additional stats for the starting players when comparing the sum of the 70 total player stats at the end of everything. Anyway, I say that because we need to pick 8 to get the best results at the end of everything. So Shield makes the side, and that's probably not a major surprise considering his stats, but the one that might is Perkins. And I'm sure some of you are looking at the numbers going, how does Roberts miss the 2024 mid group? Well, Roberts was a -2 when compared to Perkins, as Perkins had better marks inside 50 and handball efficiency, just getting the Bombers' total team output over the line for a point in both those stats. So that's the mid lineup for both years. Before we move on, keep in mind what we've discussed about the bench so far, and considering there is no more changes here, let's change everyone's numbers to their top 4 mid numbers going forward. Now, let's look at the mids charts. So if we look at the players individually, only a few things jump out immediately. As a side note, Dersman's hit-outs gathered and centre clearances aren't really a worry, as he didn't attend a single centre bounce last season. Most of the things are where you'd want them to be as a whole, but like the defenders, inside 50s look reliant on just a few. And while score involvements isn't outstanding, it's not as bad as shots, where Merritt and Caldwell are the only ones really where you'd want them to be. Moving on to the group's efforts, hit-outs gathered are good, both clearance stats are good enough, and then when not in possession, tackles and pressure acts have healthy numbers too. Where I think things might be going wrong is efficiency or again aggressiveness with ball. While disposals are good and handball receives are quite good, that doesn't seem to translate into particularly high levels of inside 50s, score involvements or shots. This is further shown by the disposals per shot rating being the 5th worst in the league at 15.59, which is 1.32 more disposals per shot than the league average. So in 2024, the sum of Essendon's midfield output had 20 out of 42 important midfield stats above that of a top 4 midfield. And considering there is no major changes here, it seems unlikely that the numbers change too. Like defence, there needs to be higher priority on getting the ball in the forward half of the ground and starting more of their score launches from there. The Bombers had 36.8% of their scoring generated from the forward half. This was 3.6 behind the AFL average and 10.2 behind the Premiers. But Essendon were the 4th best last year at scores generated from the centre bounce at 13%. So let's see what the Bombers have been doing there and if there's anything that the ruck could improve upon. Last year, Sam Draper played 16 matches, Todd Goldstein played 14, and Nick Bryan got 2. The Bombers drafted WA ruck forward Cale Guerin with pick 37, and while I've seen it suggested that he might get some games this coming season, I don't think he's best 22 yet, so we won't be discussing him any further. With a total of 35 matches played this past year, dividing by 23, we can see that the Bombers average and prefer 1.52 rucks per match. While Draper was the standout, the differences become more minor when you look at a top 4 average. And considering the preference to play a second ruck fairly often, the question becomes, should the Bombers play 2 rucks or not? Well, to decide that, we again have to discuss the bench. With 1 spot left, as the other 3 roles have gone to mids, that leaves no direct assistance for the defenders or the forwards if we choose a ruckman here. Personally, I think the last spot does go to a tall, but not a ruck, and the sum of stats at the end of everything supports that, so only 1 ruck will be chosen. Because I haven't explicitly stated it, yes, Draper is getting the starting spot, so let's look at the ruck key stats. Starting with the positives, Draper is ahead in marks and score involvements, and he's also close enough for total clearances, 1%ers and spoils, but everything else is behind target. I think most Bombers fans won't need stats for me to back up this statement, but essentially Draper is good at getting forward and getting on the scoreboard, but not much when defending. but let's find some stats to back that up. In 2024, for a ruckman, he was equal third in average goals, equal fourth for average shots, but he was second last for pressure acts and equal second last for defensive pressure acts. And while he did only average 1.4 intercept possessions, which was 11th last, he was ahead of Goldstein and Bryan at 10th last and 6th last respectively. So basically, Draper is okay and particularly good at getting forward and putting pressure on the opposition ruckman to defend. But he needs to start putting pressure on the opposition team more in general. As a general though, the defense, mids, ruck lines have all had 40% or more of stats above that of the top 4 teams. So let's have a look at the forwards to see if they can maintain those numbers or if that explains last year's ladder position. Essendon's key forwards in 2024 were Kyle Langford, Peter Wright, Harrison Jones and Nate Caddy, who all played over 12 matches. So clearly Langford and Wright make the side, but who joins them? Well, I think most Bombers supporters would have liked what they saw from Caddy, and he will get a spot in the side. But here we get to the bench again. With so many positions given to mids, many of them will have to be flexible positionally, and I think they'll have to do the same with their talls. I understand Laverde is training as a forward, so I considered giving him this position, but I think they need to keep trying to develop their existing youth, and considering Jones spent large chunks of last year on the wing, I'd back him to keep developing into a full swingman. Hence, I've got him on the bench in the final spot. So, we've locked down the key forward roles. Let's have a look at the key forwards chart. In general, Langford is a bit behind target for contested marks and offensive 1v1s, but otherwise everything is above target or near enough. When we look at Wright, Caddy and Jones, only really Total Marks has everyone on target. Otherwise everyone has areas of improvements, with shots and goals obviously being the most important. But that starts with more marks inside 50. With limited marks per inside 50, let's have a look at the medium forwards to see if they're getting good crumbing numbers. The mid-medium forwards last year were Matt Guelphy, Jake Stringer, Jade Gresham, Nick Hind, Ben Hobbs, and Alwyn Davey Jr., who all played over 10 matches. The Bombers also picked up youngsters Isaac Kako and Archer Day-Wicks via the national and rookie drafts, but did not add a medium forward with AFL experience. With a total of 109 matches played, dividing by 23, we can see the Bombers average and prefer 4.74 or roughly 5 mid-medium forwards per match. But considering the decisions we've made regarding the bench, we will only be taking 3 into each year. There was a standout 3 in this role anyway, being Guelphy, Stringer and Gresham. But with Stringer's departure, who gets the final mid-medium forward role in 2025? Well, I think most pundits would add Kako, and I'm not going to differ from the pack here. Considering Kako hasn't played yet, I'm sure some of you are asking how I'm going to compare his output if he hasn't played a match. Good question. I've explained it in previous club reviews, so go and watch them at the end of this, but I'm gonna be lazy. I haven't set up a particularly good way to project lower level stats to AFL level yet, so I'm gonna take the first year stats of a player they were compared to prior to the draft. Rookie Me compared Kako to the wizard Nick Watson, so we'll be taking his first year stats and using them in Kako's place. So that's the 2024 and 2025 lineups. Before we look at overalls and conclusions, let's have a look at the mid-medium forwards chart. Starting with the positives, ground ball gets are good, pressure acts and score involvement too, and Stringer was pulling some contract year magic, particularly in marks inside 50s, shots and goals. So hopefully Kako can maintain these strengths. And look, while most things decrease in output, there might be areas that are flipped on its head. With crumbs, an area in which the Bombers would want to improve, going from Stringer's 0.65 per match to nearly tripling with the numbers we've given to Kako at 1.7. So let's move to the overall forward chart outputs between years. And if I'm honest, this is generally okay, but year on year, nothing does improve, with the exception of crumbing, and much of this is based on Kako being able to produce just as well as Watson did last year, and Watson was the 8th best mid-medium forward at crumbing in 2024. In 2024, the sum of Essendon's forward line output had 25 out of 51 important forward stats above that of a top 4 forward line. With this lineup for 2025, the projected sum of the Bombers' forward line output would see them with a minor reduction to 22 out of 51 important stats above a top 4 forward line. Considering the loss of Stringer's strength and experience, In the grand scheme of things, I think moving on to Kako is probably best, but I do worry about who they could turn to if needed. So let's show the final numbers for each line as we reflect upon what we've learned. It has been suggested to me before that I rate the Bombers list too harshly, and I think that statement was correct. The Bombers list had the highest score from a starting 22 that we've reviewed so far, so before I give those numbers, let's discuss what I think still needs to improve. In a sentence, the Bombers' issues are partly player-based, but considering the good player stats, I'd argue it's also tactically. In terms of players, the Bombers starters are good, but they simply don't have a ton of experience depth. For key defenders, Reed's body hasn't allowed him to get as many games as you'd like, and Laverde last year had the 5th worst 1v1 loss percentage from key defenders that played over 5 games. For medium defenders, we had everybody that played in the 2024 side bar Jake Kelly, and then he and Dyson Heppell retired in the offseason, leaving Archie Roberts as the next best option that played last year. We have a similar problem with the medium forwards this year. After Guelphy and Gresham, no one had over 50% of stats above that of an average mid-medium forward, let alone a top 4 player. So again, there's little in terms of experience in their depth. This is why we went with so many mids, and should they have similar injury issues this coming year with Parrish, Shield and Setterfield, the depth here could too be tested. And that's partially why I think there needs to be some adjustment tactically. The Bombers averaged more disposals than any other team last year, but their disposal per shot rate was 5th worst with 15.59, which is 1.32 more than the average and 3 behind the Premiers. So if they're forced to play younger players, while exuberant, they might not have the stamina and experience to last a full match of keepings off. Defensively, the Bombers have many positives, but they need to start being more aggressive with their possessions. As mentioned earlier, they were behind in shots from defensive half, but their additional usage from defense also led to the 4th highest opposition scoring from defensive half at 35%. Also, opposition scoring percentage from turnover was also 4th last, conceding 51.4% of the Bombers' total points against. When looking at mids and the rucks, they again have many positives, being the 4th best in scores from centre bounce at 13%. I think the main thing here again is movement from defense to offense, and I think Draper also needs to get back and help the defenders more often. The Bombers' scoring source was majoritively based around turnover at 45.3%, and the origin of scoring was mostly from the forward half at 36.8%. So while they might not be aggressive enough with disposal going forward, it does seem like they intend to do an intercept-based forward press style structure, and I think that is something they should lean into. With the experience behind the ball and energetic youngsters like Caddy and Kako up forward, I do think that this poses as their best option structurally. But enough of my yapping, let's get to the final numbers.
Give them the number!
In total, we used 70 player stats against a top 4 player in the same role to determine the effectiveness of the 6 different player types we use. We also used player cumulative averages to see if they surpass the expected output of a top 4 defense, midfield, ruck line and forward line to see if the group might work well together or not. Technically, we can look at all of those 70 important stats and see how the whole team fares against an average top 4 side. In 2024, the sum of Essendon's output had 38 out of 70, or roughly 54% of important stats above a top 4 side. With this lineup for 2025, the projected sum of the Bombers' output would see them drop to 34 out of 70, or roughly 49% of stats above a top 4 side. So as a general, I think the Bombers have a good starting list, but beyond that, it lacks experience, particularly with the changes this offseason. And should they suffer similar injuries as last year to this, I think it becomes a tougher year. I'll do some prediction videos as we get closer to the next season, but Wheeler Ratings has them with a 32% chance of making the finals and a 12% chance of making the top 4. Thank you for watching our assessment of the Bombers 2024 team and what some of the changes they've made this offseason might bring. My name's Woody and this is Wooden Spoon Data. If you like this video and you want to see some more data-focused AFL content, click the subscribe button and the notification bell to be kept up to date. YouTube also suggests some videos nowadays. They should be up on the side here, so if you're interested, go have a look. Thanks again, have a good day.